Welcome to the final lesson of Become a CSS Superhero with Stylus. In this final lesson, we're going to be creating a really powerful mix-in that's going to save you a lot of time. This mix-in will let you generate all of your H tag code for every project that you ever create just by using one single line of code. And normally it takes about 25 to 35 lines of code to generate your heading tags. And that's a real pain to have to write out every time. And then if you decide you want to change your font family or your line height, you have to update all those styles, H1 through H6. With this technique, it becomes much easier to make adjustments. All right, we are going to begin with a few variables. These variables will control the line height, the font family, and the font weight of your heading tags. So we'll grab some variables that I prepared earlier. Again, just to make this a little bit faster for you to watch. All right, so we've got typography, H font line height. Sometimes I find it helps to put a little prefix on the beginning of your variables. That way when you start to have a lot of variables in your project, the ones that are prefaced with type, you know they're typography related, or you can preface your colors with color and so on. We also have a nice font stack here that we're going to be using for our heading font family. Now, I've grabbed that from cssfontstack.com, by the way, which is a really good resource to generate font stacks. And we're going to be setting our default font weight to 700. Now to create the mix-in. Now you already know how to create a mix-in. You just set up your name and place your brackets in. Now we want to start by setting these variables, all three, against all 6 of our heading levels. And that's done very simply by just entering the CSS that needs to be used. So we have a comma separated list of all of our heading tag levels, and then we're just grabbing the variables from here and placing them in the CSS. Now we can grab our mix-in name and just paste it in to our main style area to output our existing mix-in content. Now you can see that that immediately affected the headings on this page. They all have the consistent font family, line height, and font weight. And this is the CSS that's been output. Now we want to control the actual size and the margin, the top and bottom margin of each heading. I find that the default sizing and margin of heading tags is a little bit out of whack, and we're going to adjust that to make it have a little bit more flow. And we're going to start that process with something called a hash. Now a hash is basically just a set of information. I'll show you what they look like. This is our hash of heading font sizes. So on the left you have what are called your keys. So these heading tags, these are your keys. And on the right you have the values that are set against those keys. Now we are going to do something called iteration to go through each one of the items that are saved inside this hash and output them against the correct heading tag. Iteration basically just means to loop through something. So we'll loop through this hash to get the right numbers out. Now the way that we do that inside our H tag mix-in is to use a for loop. So we're going to say for H level. H level will be a tag that we are going to use to represent each one of these keys. As we loop through this hash, the stylus will pull out these key names and it will save those key names against this H level tag that we've allocated as part of our code. Then we're going to say get the value in our hash. So that means for each of these keys, get the value, so that's this value on the right, out of the type H font sizes hash. Now that'll make a little bit more sense when you see it working. And the next thing that we need to do is make sure that we're actually having the right heading tag output as part of our code. And to do that, we're going to do something called interpolation. In this case, all that's going to do, all that means is to just take the key value that is being fed through this H level tag and pass it into our selector. And in simple terms, that just means wrap it in curly brackets. So we'll put H level. Now what that will do is just put H1 or H2, H3, H4, H5, H6 in our CSS. And then we will have it output the font size that it's just grabbed out of the type H font sizes hash. And we do that simply by using our unit variable again. And we know that it is pulling this value. So again, that's this right column out of our hash. So we'll take that value and we'll add an M unit to it. Okay, let's see that working. And there you have it. You can see that we now have a much more appropriate set of sizing for our headings. And in our CSS, you can see that it has now output all of the correct code. This has come from our interpolation. So that's this part of the mix-in. And then we have the font size CSS, which has come from here. And then the actual number, 2.25, has come out of our hash, having been passed through this value. Okay, now we can repeat that same process to get very nice vertical margins added to our headings. Again, we're going to create a hash to represent the vertical margins that we want to use. And we have the same set of keys down the left column with a new set of values. And now all we have to do is enter our margin. We're going to use the unit function again, but this time it's a little bit different. Right now, the hash that we are looping through, the hash that we are iterating, is this type H font size hash. So there's no information in this hash about our vertical margins. All our vertical margins are held in this hash. So we need a way to look up the information out of this hash. And that's why we have created the same keys in both hashes. Now what we can do is use the key, which we already have via looping through our first hash. And we can use that key to look up the values from the second hash. So if we say, go to the type H font B margins hash, enter some square brackets and tell it that you want to look up the current key that you're looking at from inside the type H font sizes. And because these match, when you are at the H1 stage of the font sizes hash, if you tell it to look up the matching H1 vertical margins entry in the vertical margins hash, you'll get the right number. We're going to add an M unit to it. And we'll say 0 margins left and right. Okay, now that is a better level of vertical margin. You can see how things work much better in the flow of text. And to look at the generated CSS, now you can see that it has grabbed all those values out of our vertical margin hash. And from here on, if you want to change the font size of all of your heading tags, or if you want to adjust your vertical margins, you can just come to this hash and make your changes there, and everything else will be updated. Now, there's one more thing that we want to add in. One of the most common things you'll find yourself doing when you're creating your responsive media queries is downsizing your heading tags. They're one of the first things that becomes too cramped as you start to be working within a smaller width. And to make this a really easy problem to deal with, we're going to add an argument to our mixin that will allow you to pass a multiplier. That way, if you say you want your headings to now be 80% of their original size, you would pass 0.8. Then your font sizes and your margins will be multiplied by 0.8, making them come out at 80% of the values that you have entered under your hashes. Now, here's how we'll do it. First, we'll create the argument, and we're going to call it factor, because this is the factor we'll be multiplying by. And we'll set it to a default of 1. Now we're going to apply that factor against our font size. Now, to do that, we're going to create a new variable, and we're going to call it size. And we're going to say that size will be equal to value, which is what we were putting straight in against our font size, but we want it now to be multiplied by our factor. So now, instead of putting the value straight in here, we'll put our new size variable. And by default, the factor is set to 1. And that means you're not going to see any change the first time that we save this. No change, just as we expected. But let's see what happens if we use that same mixin under a media query, passing a factor to multiply by. We'll head down the bottom of our style sheet. We'll add it in a media query. Now, this is set to kick in at 500 flexible pixels wide, as in the rem equivalent to 500 pixels. And we're passing a value of 0.8. Now, that means that all our headings should be scaled down to 80% of their original size. As you see this get thinner, you'll see it jump down in size. There you go. So now all of the headings have become proportionally smaller, just as we wanted. And let's add another media query to make them smaller again. We'll say 400. That's 65%. And let's do one more. Max width 300 at 50%. And we'll go smaller again. There you go. There's another level of scaling down, all the way down to our smaller size. However, there's one problem. Right now, the heading level 6 is smaller than our main text. And that's something you're never going to want. You're always going to want your headings to be larger than your main text. And what we need to do there to prevent that is make sure that even when you're scaling your headings down, they never go any lower than 1em in size. And to fix that, we're going to run a check. So before we slot the size variable in against our font size, we're going to make sure that it's at least 1em. If it's something lower than 1em, we'll reset that variable to equal 1em. If it's higher than 1em, then it'll just go in unchanged. And we're going to do that with something called a ternary operator. Now, a ternary operator is a way of just shortcutting your code where you might need to write a long if-else conditional check. A ternary operator can make things much more concise. Now, this is our ternary operator that's going to take care of the job. Now, what's happening here is between these opening brackets, you have the condition that's being tested for. So we're multiplying value by factor. And then we're asking, is value by factor less than 1? And you see the little question mark here. So this is the question that's being asked at the start of this ternary operator. Is value times factor less than 1? If the answer is yes, then we do this. So if the answer to the question is value times factor less than 1, yes, then we should say, well, size needs to equal 1, and we set that here. If the answer to that question is no, then we say, okay, go ahead and set size to equal value times factor. Now let's see that work. And right away, our heading level 6 has been corrected so that it's not smaller than the surrounding text anymore. You can safely deploy that heading mix-in anytime you need to scale down your overall text, knowing that you're not going to end up with any funny, tiny little headings that are smaller than the rest of your fonts. And you can also take away from this lesson that some of these elements of stylus that might have names that seem off-putting, like hashes and iteration and interpolation, they're not actually that complex when you really get down to it. A hash is just a set of information. Interpolation is just sticking something in curly brackets so you can use it in a selector. And iteration is just going through something in a loop until you've gotten all the stuff out of it that you need. And that brings us to the end of our final lesson in Become a CSS Superhero with Stylus. In the next video, we're going to recap everything that you've learned because it's been a lot. And I'm going to give you some extra tips on where you can go next with your CSS Superhero training.